If you were to ask anyone about us, they'd probably say that Laura and I had one of those picture-perfect marriages. You know, the kind you see on greeting cards or in commercials. White picket fence, matching smiles, always hand in hand. At least, that's what it looked like from the outside. We were the couple everyone envied at dinner parties, the pair that seemed to glide through life with ease. But behind closed doors, things weren't always as harmonious as they seemed. I met Laura during a conference in Barcelona. I was there presenting some new software my company had just rolled out, and she was attending as a marketing consultant for one of our biggest clients. She was mesmerizing. Not in a loud, flashy way, but with a quiet confidence and grace that drew you in. Her laughter was infectious, her wit sharp. It didn't take long for us to hit it off, and before I knew it, we were sharing stories over coffee, then wine, and finally, a bed. Our relationship took off from there. We spent every moment we could together, even though we lived in different cities back then. I would take late-night trains to see her, and she'd surprise me with visits whenever she could sneak away from work. We got married 2 years later, in a small ceremony by the beach, just the two of us and a handful of close friends. It was simple, beautiful, and exactly what we wanted. After we got married, we moved into a spacious apartment in the city. I was climbing the corporate ladder, working long hours, but I always made time for Laura. She had taken a job at a boutique marketing firm nearby and was quickly making a name for herself. We supported each other's careers and shared everything, our dreams, our fears, our plans for the future. Or at least, I thought we did. Our sex life was good, if not great. We were always in sync, or so I believed. We had our moments of passion, the kind that would make you late for work the next day, but as time went on, things started to feel different. It wasn't that Laura wasn't affectionate, she was, but there was a shift, a subtle change in the air between us. The way she touched me felt more like routine than desire. The sex became predictable, and while I chalked it up to the natural course of a long-term relationship, there was a part of me that missed the fire we once had. I was never the jealous type. I trusted Laura implicitly. She was my wife, my partner, my best friend. But as time went on, little things started to bother me. She'd come home later than usual, blaming it on work. She'd be glued to her phone, texting someone while I sat next to her on the couch, feeling like an outsider in my own home. When I asked who she was talking to, she'd brush it off, saying it was just a friend or a colleague. And I believed her. Why wouldn't I? We were happy, weren't we? But there was this nagging feeling, a small voice in the back of my head that I couldn't quite shake. I dismissed it at first, telling myself I was being paranoid. Laura loved me. She wouldn't betray me. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, that voice grew louder, until I couldn't ignore it any longer. Looking back, I can see the signs now, the small cracks in the foundation of our marriage that I chose to overlook. The way she'd avoid eye contact when I asked about her day, the way her body would stiffen when I reached out to touch her, the way she'd pull away from me in bed. But at the time, I convinced myself it was just a rough patch, something every couple goes through. I never imagined it could be anything more. And then there were the unexplained absences. The business trips that seemed to pop up out of nowhere, the late nights at the office that became more and more frequent. I'd ask her about them, and she'd give me vague answers, telling me not to worry. And I didn't. I trusted her, loved her, and wanted to believe that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew something was off. I just wasn't ready to face the truth. It wasn't until a few months ago that I started noticing the changes in Laura. They were small at first, so small, in fact, that I almost missed them. But once I started paying attention, I couldn't unsee them. The way she'd smile when she looked at her phone, a smile that wasn't for me. The way she'd become defensive whenever I asked about her day. The way her eyes would dart away from mine when I asked if everything was okay. We used to talk about everything, but now our conversations had become stilted, filled with awkward silences and half-truths. She was hiding something. I could feel it. But whenever I tried to bring it up, she'd deflect, changing the subject or making some excuse to leave the room. It was like she was slipping away from me, one piece at a time, and I had no idea how to stop it. I remember one night in particular. I had just come home from work, exhausted from a long day of meetings and deadlines. Laura was already home, curled up on the couch with her phone in hand. She barely looked up when I walked in, just mumbled a quick hello before returning to whatever she was doing. I watched her for a moment, my heart sinking as I realized just how distant she'd become. "Laura," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "is everything okay?" She looked up at me, her eyes wide with surprise, as if she hadn't even noticed I was there. "Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't it be?" I wanted to tell her how I felt, to ask her what was going on, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, forcing a smile as I sat down next to her. We watched TV in silence that night, but I wasn't really paying attention. My mind was racing, trying to piece together the puzzle of what had gone wrong between us. Then, there were the late-night phone calls. She'd get up in the middle of the night, claiming she couldn't sleep, and go to the living room to read. But when I'd wake up hours later, she'd still be there, her phone glowing in the dark as she whispered into it. I asked her about it once, but she just laughed it off, saying she was catching up with a friend who lived in a different time zone. It didn't feel right, but I didn't push it. After all, Laura was my wife. I trusted her. But that trust was starting to wear thin. Every time she left the room to take a call, every time she stayed out late with friends, every time she turned away from me in bed, I felt the weight of doubt pressing down on me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I had no reason to suspect anything. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it gnawed at me, until I couldn't take it anymore. And then, last night, everything changed. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard Laura's phone buzz on the nightstand. She was in the bathroom, so I picked it up, thinking it might be important. That's when I saw the message. "I want you. Get rid of this cuckold today." My heart stopped. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The words were like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of me. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking as 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Who was this? What the hell was going on? And then, as if in a trance, I heard Laura's voice behind me. "What are you doing with my phone?" she asked, her voice trembling. I turned around, and the look on her face was all the confirmation I needed. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear as she realized what I'd just seen. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us thick with tension. Then, without thinking, I grabbed her phone and did something I never thought I'd do. I sent a message to her lover. As my thumb hovered over the keyboard, a mixture of rage and disbelief surged through me. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, one where the ground had just crumbled beneath my feet, leaving me suspended over a void of betrayal and pain. But instead of falling, I acted. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let this bastard get away with it, and I wasn't going to let Laura slither out of this either. I typed the words quickly, my hands steady, despite the storm raging inside me. "Yes, dear, I'll be waiting for you in an hour. He's at a conference today." I hit send before I could second-guess myself. I felt a sick satisfaction knowing this man, this stranger who thought he could steal my wife from me, would soon be walking into a trap. Laura's eyes widened as she realized what I had just done. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked like she might faint. You don't understand," she stammered, taking a step back as I advanced on her. "Don't I?" I snapped, my voice cold, devoid of any of the warmth it used to hold for her. "What is there to understand, Laura? That you've been screwing around behind my back? That you've been lying to me for God knows how long? Save it." She recoiled like I'd struck her, tears welling up in her eyes. But I wasn't moved. Not this time. The Laura I loved was gone, replaced by a stranger I barely recognized. "Who is he?" I demanded. "How long has this been going on?" Laura didn't answer. She just stood there, her body trembling, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal searching for an escape. But there was no way out. Not this time. "Who is he?" I repeated, my voice rising with each word. She shook her head, a strangled sob escaping her lips. "Please let me explain," she whispered, but I wasn't interested in hearing her lies. Not anymore. "No, Laura, you've had your chance to explain, to tell me the truth. But instead, you've been sneaking around lying to my face, fucking someone else while I've been here, trusting you, loving you." My voice cracked at the last word, the pain seeping through despite my best efforts to keep it at bay. Laura looked like she wanted to say something, to defend herself, but I wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. She needed to face what she had done. I wasn't. The fool she thought I was. I grabbed her by the wrist and dragged her down the hall to the bedroom. She didn't resist, didn't say a word as I yanked open the closet door and threw her inside. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the bed. But I didn't care. I was beyond caring. "You stay here," I growled, slamming the door shut and locking it. "Don't make a sound. Don't even think about trying to run." The silence that followed was deafening. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat like a hammer driving the reality of what was happening deeper into my skull. Laura was cheating on me, my wife. The woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with had betrayed me in the worst possible way. I leaned against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to process everything. I felt like I was going to be sick. How had it come to this? We had been so happy, or at least I thought we were, but clearly I had been living in some sort of delusion, blind to what was happening right under my nose. For a brief moment, I considered letting her go, letting her take whatever dignity she had left and leave. But then I remembered the message. That vile message. "Get rid of this cuckold today." The audacity, the sheer nerve of it. No, I wasn't going to let her off that easily. And I sure as hell wasn't going to let this man walk away unscathed. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the fury that was bubbling inside me. It wasn't easy, but I knew I had to keep my head clear. I couldn't afford to lose control, not now, not when there was so much at stake. With a renewed sense of purpose, I made my way to the kitchen and grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a baseball bat. I wasn't sure what I planned to do with it, but just holding it made me feel better, gave me a sense of power I desperately needed. I set it by the door and took a seat in the living room, facing the entrance. And then I waited. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one stretching into an eternity. My mind was racing, a chaotic whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Images of Laura with this man, her lover, flashed through my mind, each one more painful than the last. I could see them together, laughing, kissing, making love in some cheap hotel room while I sat at home like an idiot, thinking everything was fine. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to make them both pay for what they had done to me. But I couldn't do that. Not yet. I had to wait. I had to be patient. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard the sound of footsteps outside the door. My heart leaped into my throat as I tightened my grip on the bat. This was it. He was here. The man who had destroyed my marriage, who had taken everything from me, was about to walk through that door, and I was ready for him. I heard the key turn in the lock, the door creaking open slowly. My pulse quickened as I watched the door swing wide, revealing a tall, dark figure standing in the doorway. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room, clearly not expecting to see me sitting there, bat in hand, waiting for him. For a split second, we just stared at each other. I could see the realization dawning on his face, the way his eyes widened in shock, his mouth falling open slightly. He wasn't prepared for this. He thought he'd be walking into Laura's arms, but instead, he'd walked straight into my trap. "Hello, asshole," I said, my voice low and menacing. "We need to talk." Before he could react, I was on him. I swung the bat with all the strength I could muster, aiming for his head. He barely had time to raise his arms in defense before the bat connected with a sickening thud. He staggered back, crashing into the wall, a look of disbelief and fear in his eyes. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. I swung again, this time hitting him in the ribs. He gasped, doubling over in pain, but I didn't let up. I kept swinging over and over until he was on the floor, groaning in agony. The sound of bone cracking under the force of the blows was both horrifying and satisfying. All the rage, all the pain I had been holding inside poured out with each strike. I didn't stop until he was motionless, lying in a crumpled heap on the floor, blood pooling around his broken body. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, the bat still clenched in my hands. My entire body was shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had done it. I had taken my revenge. But as I looked down at the man lying at my feet, a cold realization began to set in. What had I done? The weight of my actions hit me like a ton of bricks. I had crossed a line, one that I could never uncross. The man lying on the floor was a living reminder of that. My marriage was over, my life as I knew it was over, and all that was left was this, the aftermath of a betrayal that had driven me to the edge. I didn't know what to do next. Should I call the police? An ambulance? Should I tell Laura? The questions raced through my mind, but none of them had easy answers. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here, couldn't face the consequences of what I had done. So I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the park, the one Laura and I used to walk through on Sunday mornings. It was a place filled with memories, once a symbol of our love and happiness. Now, it was just another reminder of everything I'd lost. The park was deserted, save for the occasional passerby, but I barely noticed them. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the last hour over and over again, each time more surreal than the last. I sat down on a bench, the cold metal seeping through my clothes as I tried to catch my breath. My hands were still trembling, and I could feel the weight of the bat in my grip, even though I had left it behind. My knuckles were white, my skin clammy. I looked down at them, half expecting to see blood, but there was nothing, just the faint tremors of adrenaline and fear. How had it come to this? How had I gone from being a loving husband, a man who would have done anything for his wife, to this, a man who had just beaten another human being to a pulp? It didn't seem real, like something out of a movie or a nightmare. But the pain in my chest, the crushing guilt that was slowly suffocating me, told me otherwise. This was real. This was my life now. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the image of that man's face, the fear in his eyes, the sound of his bones breaking under the force of my blows, but it was no use. Every time I closed my eyes, he was there, haunting me, reminding me of what I had done. I could still feel the impact of the bat in my hands, the way it had connected with his flesh, the way his body had crumpled under the assault. It was like a bad dream that I couldn't wake up from. I should have felt satisfied, justified even. After all, he was the one who had betrayed me, who had stolen my wife from me. But instead, all I felt was emptiness, a hollow, gnawing void that nothing could fill. I had thought that revenge would make me feel better, that it would bring me some sort of closure, but all it had done was leave me more broken than before. I tried to think of what to do next, but my mind was a jumbled mess. Should I go back? Should I face Laura and deal with the aftermath of what I had done? Or should I just disappear, leave this life behind and start over somewhere else? The thought of running away was tempting, but I knew deep down that it wasn't an option. I couldn't outrun what I had done. I couldn't outrun myself. After what felt like hours, I finally forced myself to get up. My legs were stiff, my body sore from the tension and exertion. I started walking, not really sure where I was going, just needing to move, to do something other than sit there and wallow in my misery. The streets were quiet, the city asleep, but I felt more awake than ever, my senses heightened by the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I wandered aimlessly, my thoughts as scattered as the leaves that swirled around my feet. Every step I took felt like a step away from my old life, from the man I used to be. I didn't recognize myself anymore, didn't know who I was or what I was capable of. The man who had walked into that apartment earlier tonight was gone, replaced by someone I didn't understand, someone I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Eventually, I found myself outside a small, nondescript bar, tucked away in a side street. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow on the sidewalk. Without really thinking about it, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The place was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke. A few patrons sat hunched over their drinks at the bar, but they didn't pay me any attention as I made my way to a corner table. I sat down, my hands still shaking as I reached for the menu. But I couldn't focus on the words. My mind was too preoccupied with everything that had just happened. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that I hadn't even noticed creeping up on me. I felt like I could sleep for a week, but I knew that sleep wouldn't come easy. Not after what I had done. A waitress appeared at my table, her tired eyes scanning me with mild interest. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice flat, disinterested. "Whiskey," I muttered, not bothering to look up. "Double." She nodded and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stared at the worn wood of the table, tracing the cracks with my fingers as I tried to make sense of the chaos in my mind. What was I going to do? How was I going to fix this? Could I even fix it? Or was everything beyond repair? The waitress returned a moment later, setting the glass of whiskey down in front of me. I wrapped my fingers around it, savoring the coolness of the glass against my skin. I didn't hesitate as I brought it to my lips, the burn of the alcohol a welcome distraction from the pain in my chest. I downed it in one gulp, the warmth spreading through my body, dulling the edges of my thoughts just enough to take the edge off. But the relief was short-lived. As soon as the glass was empty, the guilt came crashing back, heavier than before. I slumped in my seat, the weight of everything pressing down on me, suffocating me. What had I done? I kept asking myself the same question over and over, but I had no answers. All I knew was that I had crossed a line that I could never uncross, and there was no going back. I thought about calling Laura, about telling her that I was sorry, that I had made a terrible mistake, but what good would that do? The damage was done. There was no way to undo it, no way to take back what I had done. And even if there was, I wasn't sure I deserved forgiveness. Not after what I had done to her, to myself, to that man. But as much as I wanted to disappear, to run away from the mess I had made, I knew that I couldn't. I had to face the consequences of my actions, no matter how much it terrified me. I had to go back. I had to face Laura, and whatever was waiting for me at home. I threw some money on the table and got up, my legs shaky as I made my way out of the bar. The cool night air hit me like a slap in the face, waking me up just enough to start the long walk home. My mind was still racing, a chaotic mess of guilt, fear, and regret, but I forced myself to keep moving. One step at a time, one breath at a time. As I neared our apartment building, I felt my heart start to race again. I wasn't sure what I would find when I walked through that door, wasn't sure if I was ready to face it, but I didn't have a choice. I had to do this. I had to face the reality of what I had done. I reached the door and paused, my hand hovering over the handle. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, trying to prepare for whatever was waiting for me on the other side. And then, with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was eerily quiet when I walked in, the silence broken only by the sound of my own footsteps on the hardwood floor. I half expected to see Laura standing there, waiting for me, but the living room was empty. The bat was still lying on the floor where I had dropped it, a stark reminder of the violence that had taken place just hours before. The sight of it made my stomach turn, but I forced myself to look away, to focus on what I needed to do. I walked down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached the bedroom door. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What would I find on the other side? Was she still there, locked in the room where I had left her, or had she found a way out? The thought of her being gone filled me with a strange mix of relief and dread. Part of me wanted her to be gone, to have escaped the nightmare that I had created, but another part of me needed her to be there, needed to face her, to make sense of everything that had happened. I finally mustered the courage to turn the knob and push the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside the window. I could just make out the shape of Laura sitting on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. She didn't look up when I walked in, didn't acknowledge my presence. She just sat there, her body shaking with silent sobs. I stood in the doorway, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to begin. The anger that had consumed me earlier had faded, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. I had never seen her like this before, so broken, so vulnerable. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted with my life, was now a stranger, and it was all my fault. Laura, I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't move, didn't respond. Her shoulders were hunched, and her breath hitched with each sob. The room felt suffocating, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on both of us. I took a tentative step forward, but stopped myself, unsure of what to do. I wanted to comfort her, to reach out and hold her, but the memory of what I had done, of what she had done, held me back. Laura, I said again, a little louder this time, my voice trembling, we need to talk. Slowly, she lifted her head, her tear-streaked face coming into view. Her eyes were red and swollen, filled with a pain that mirrored my own. When she met my gaze, I saw the guilt, the fear, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. There was a distance in her eyes, like a part of her had already accepted what was coming, like she had already made her peace with it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking as the words slipped out. It was barely audible, but it hit me like a ton of bricks. The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, but it didn't bring me any comfort. If anything, it made the situation even more unbearable. "Sorry?" I echoed, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "You're sorry?" She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't mean for it to happen. I never wanted to hurt you, I swear." I clenched my fists at my sides, trying to keep my emotions in check. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" I repeated, my voice rising. "How long, Laura? How long has this been going on?" She flinched at the harshness in my tone, her hands trembling in her lap. 6 months, she whispered, barely able to meet my gaze. 6 months. The words echoed in my mind, each syllable a knife to the gut. 6 months of lies, 6 months of deceit. I felt the anger bubbling up again, threatening to spill over, but I forced it down. I needed answers. I needed to understand why she had done this, why she had thrown away everything we had for some cheap thrill. "Why?" I asked, my voice cracking with the weight of the question. "Why him? Why any of this?" She let out a shuddering breath, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't know," she said, her voice hollow. "It just happened. He was there, and I cut her off. unable to listen to anymore. So it was just convenience? Just because he was there? No, she said quickly, shaking her head. It wasn't like that. At least, not at first. We started talking at work, and he made me feel something. I don't know. Alive, I guess. Alive? I spat, my voice dripping with venom. And what? I didn't do that for you anymore? Is that what this is? You were bored? She winced at my words, more tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never meant to fall for him. But I was lonely, and you were always so busy, so caught up in work. And that's your excuse? I demanded, my voice rising in anger. That's your justification for betraying me? Because I was working to provide for us? No, it's not an excuse, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There's no excuse for what I did. I know that. But I just needed someone, and he was there. And then it got out of hand, and I didn't know how to stop. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Everything she was saying made me sick to my core. But what made it worse was that a part of me understood. I had been so focused on my career, so wrapped up in my own world, that I had taken Laura for granted. I had assumed that she would always be there, that our marriage would survive anything. But I had been wrong. So wrong. Do you love him? I asked, the words coming out in a strained whisper. It was a question I didn't want to know the answer to, but I had to ask it. I had to know. She hesitated, and for a moment I thought she might lie to spare my feelings. But then she nodded, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I thought I did, she admitted, her voice breaking. But now, I don't know. I'm so confused, and I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted any of this. The room was spinning, and I had to sit down to keep from collapsing. I felt like I had just been punched in the gut, the air knocked out of me. She loved him, or at least she thought she did. The reality of it was too much to bear, the betrayal too deep. I couldn't think straight, couldn't breathe. Everything was crumbling around me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to make her feel the same pain she had inflicted on me. But instead, I just sat there, staring at her. The woman I had loved more than anything. The woman who had just shattered my world. What now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What do we do now? She looked at me, her eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. I don't know, she said, her voice trembling. I don't know how to fix this. Maybe we can't, I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. Maybe this is it. Maybe there's nothing left to fix. We sat in silence, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on us. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to move forward from this. All I knew was that everything had changed, and nothing would ever be the same again. When I finally managed to get some sleep, it was restless, plagued by nightmares that left me drenched in sweat. I woke up to the harsh morning light streaming through the curtains, my head pounding, my body aching from the tension of the night before. For a moment, I forgot where I was, forgot what had happened. But then, it all came crashing back, the memories of the previous night flooding my mind like a tidal wave. Laura was still in the bedroom, curled up on the bed, her back to me. She had finally cried herself to sleep after hours of tearful apologies and desperate attempts to explain herself. I had listened, or at least pretended to, but the words didn't really register. I was too numb, too broken to process anything she was saying. All I could think about was the man lying, unconscious in the living room, the man who had come between us, the man I had nearly killed in a fit of rage. I dragged myself out of bed, my body protesting with every movement. My limbs felt heavy, weighed down by the exhaustion and the emotional toll of the night before. I needed to get out of there, needed to clear my head, to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. I made my way to the living room, my heart pounding in my chest as I opened the door. The room was empty, the bat still lying on the floor where I had left it, but the man was gone. The sight of the empty space where his body had been sent a jolt of panic through me. Had he woken up and left? Had he gone to the police? What if he was out there, plotting his revenge, waiting for the right moment to strike back? I quickly scanned the room, looking for any signs of what might have happened, but there was nothing. No blood, no signs of a struggle, nothing to indicate that anything had taken place here. It was as if the man had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but the lingering sense of dread that hung in the air like a dark cloud. I stumbled into the kitchen, my hands shaking as I reached for the phone. I had to call someone, had to get help, but my mind was blank. Who could I call? The police? And tell them what? That I had nearly killed a man who had been sleeping with my wife? That I had lost control and beaten him within an inch of his life? The thought of it made me sick to my stomach. I couldn't go to the police. I couldn't face the consequences of what I had done. Not yet. Instead, I found myself dialing the number of the one person I thought might be able to help me. It rang a few times before he picked up, his voice groggy from sleep. Hello? Eric, it's me, I said, my voice shaky. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the confusion in his voice when he spoke again. Mark? What's going on? Why are you calling so early? I need your help, I said, my voice cracking. Something happened last night. I don't know what to do. What do you mean something happened? He asked, his tone shifting from confusion to concern. Are you okay? Is Laura okay? I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. How could I explain everything that had happened? How could I tell him that I had lost control, that I had become someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of violence, of nearly killing another man? The reality of what I had done was too much to bear, but I knew I couldn't keep it to myself. I needed help, and Eric was the only person I could trust with this. Eric, I started, my voice trembling, I found out Laura's been cheating on me. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind that feels like it stretches on for an eternity. When Eric finally spoke, his voice was cautious, as if he were trying to tread lightly over a minefield. Mark, I'm really sorry to hear that, man. I had no idea. Are you okay? No, I'm not okay, I said, the words spilling out of me in a rush. I confronted her last night, and then her lover showed up. I lost it, Eric. I completely lost it. I grabbed a bat, and I think I might have killed him. Eric's sharp intake of breath was audible over the phone, and I could practically hear the gears in his head turning as he processed what I had just told him. Jesus Christ, Mark, are you serious? Did you check to see if he was still alive when I left the room? I cut in, my voice shaky. But when I woke up this morning, he was gone. I don't know where he went or if he's planning something. I'm scared, Eric. I don't know what to do. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of us. Finally, Eric spoke, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Listen to me, Mark. You need to calm down and think this through. First things first. Are you sure there's no blood, no evidence of what happened? We need to make sure you're not leaving any traces behind. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. There's no blood. I checked. It's like he just disappeared. Okay, that's good. That's really good, Eric said, his tone a little more assured now. But you can't just sit around and wait for him to come after you, if that's what he's planning. We need to be smart about this. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to think clearly, but my mind was still a mess of confusion and fear. What do I do? Should I go to the police? Eric hesitated again, clearly weighing the options. That's a tough call. If you go to the police, you're risking everything. They might see it as self-defense, but they might not. And if he's still out there, he could tell them his side of the story and make you look like the aggressor. You're in a tricky spot, Mark. But if you don't go to the police, you're going to be living with this hanging over your head. The reality of what Eric was saying began to sink in, the full scope of the situation crashing down on me like a tidal wave. I had been so focused on the immediate aftermath, on the violence and the fear, that I hadn't thought about what came next. If Laura's lover was still out there, he could go to the police at any time. Or worse, he could come after me, looking for revenge. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Maybe I should just disappear, I said, the idea forming in my mind as I spoke. Leave the city, start over somewhere else. Maybe that's the only way out of this. Eric sighed, and I could hear the concern in his voice when he spoke. I don't know if running is the answer, Mark. It might buy you some time, but it's not going to solve the problem. You'll always be looking over your shoulder, wondering if he's going to come after you or if the police are going to show up at your door. And what about Laura? Are you just going to leave her behind? I hadn't thought about that. In the chaos of everything, Laura had become almost an afterthought, a figure in the background of this nightmare. But she was still my wife, and despite everything that had happened, I couldn't just abandon her. Could I? I don't know, Eric, I admitted, my voice breaking. I just don't know what to do. Okay, Eric said, trying to calm me down. Here's what we're going to do. First, you need to get out of that apartment. You don't know if this guy's going to come back and you need to be somewhere safe. Come to my place. We'll figure this out together. But you can't do it alone. His offer was a lifeline, and I grabbed onto it with both hands. Okay, I said, feeling a small measure of relief. I'll pack a bag and head over. Good, Eric replied. And Mark, don't do anything stupid. Just get out of there and come straight to my place. We'll figure out the next steps when you get here. Thanks, Eric, I said, the weight of gratitude heavy in my voice. I don't know what I'd do without you. We're going to get through this, Mark, he said, his voice full of conviction. Just hang in there. I hung up the phone, feeling a small sliver of hope for the first time since this nightmare began. Eric was right. I needed to get out of the apartment, away from the scene of the crime, and figure out what to do next. But as I turned to leave the kitchen, I was confronted by a sight that made my blood run cold. Laura was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock, her face pale. She had heard everything. What did you do? She whispered, her voice trembling with fear and disbelief. My heart sank as I realized the full extent of what I had just revealed. Laura knew. She knew everything. And now, there was no going back. Laura, I began, my voice shaky. I can explain. But before I could finish, she turned and ran down the hallway, disappearing into the bedroom. I heard the door slam shut behind her, the sound echoing through the apartment like a gunshot. I was left standing in the kitchen, the reality of what I had done, and what I had said, settling over me like a suffocating blanket. I had to get out of there, had to leave before Laura did something drastic, like call the police, but part of me knew that it was too late, that the damage was already done. With a heavy heart, I grabbed a bag from the closet and started throwing clothes into it, my hands shaking with fear and urgency. I had to leave. I had to get out before everything came crashing down around me. But as I packed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the nightmare, that there was still so much more to come. I zipped up the bag and slung it over my shoulder, taking one last look around the apartment. It felt like I was leaving behind not just a home, but an entire life. A life that was now in ruins, shattered by betrayal, violence, and secrets. I knew that when I walked out that door, there was no turning back. But I also knew that I didn't have a choice. With a deep breath, I walked down the hallway, pausing outside the bedroom door. I could hear Laura inside, her muffled sobs breaking my heart all over again. I wanted to say something, to offer some kind of comfort, but the words wouldn't come. There was nothing I could say that would make this right. So, Without another word, I turned and left the apartment, closing the door softly behind me. The sound of it clicking shut was like the closing of a chapter in a book, one that I knew would haunt me for the rest of my life. The cold air outside was a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the apartment. It bit at my skin, a cruel reminder that the world outside hadn't changed, even though everything inside me had. I pulled the collar of my jacket up against the wind and started walking, my feet moving almost of their own accord. I had no real plan, no clear direction, just the need to get away, to put as much distance between myself and the scene of my crime as, possible. The city was just waking up, the streets still quiet, the first light of dawn casting long shadows across the pavement. I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone I passed, my mind racing with thoughts of what I'd left behind. Laura's tear-streaked face haunted me, her wide eyes filled with shock and betrayal. I could only imagine what was going through her mind, the fear and confusion that must have been tearing her apart. I walked for what felt like hours, my body moving on autopilot as my thoughts swirled in a chaotic mess. I kept replaying the events of the last day over and over in my mind, each memory more painful than the last. The confrontation, the violence, the confession to Eric. It all felt like a bad dream, something that couldn't possibly be real. But the weight of the bag on my shoulder, the soreness in my muscles, the lingering taste of fear in my mouth, they were all too real. When I finally reached Eric's apartment, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I stood outside his building for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This was it, the last refuge, the only place I could think of to go. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew that I couldn't face it alone. I buzzed his apartment, and after a few moments his voice crackled through the intercom. "Mark? Is that you?" "Yeah, it's me," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause, and then the door buzzed open. I pushed it open and made my way up the stairs, my legs feeling like lead. By the time I reached Eric's door, I was trembling, a combination of exhaustion and fear threatening to overwhelm me. I knocked softly, and within seconds, the door swung open, revealing Eric standing there, his face etched with concern. "Jesus, Mark," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "You look like hell." "I feel like it," I muttered, stepping into the warmth of his apartment. The familiar smell of coffee and the faint scent of aftershave greeted me, a stark contrast to the chaos of my own life. It was comforting, in a way, but it also made me painfully aware of how much I had lost. Eric shut the door behind me and gestured toward the couch. "Sit down. I'll get you something to drink." I collapsed onto the couch, my body sinking into the cushions as if they might swallow me whole. The exhaustion was overwhelming, but my mind wouldn't stop racing, replaying every mistake, every moment of weakness over and over again. I heard Eric in the kitchen, the clinking of glasses and the hiss of the coffee machine, but it all felt distant, like it was happening in another world. He returned a moment later with 2 cups of coffee, setting one down in front of me before taking a seat in the armchair opposite. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the steam rising from the mugs between us, filling the room with the bitter aroma of coffee. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, couldn't bear to see the concern in his eyes, the unspoken questions that I didn't have answers to. Finally, Eric broke the silence. "So, what happened?" I stared into the coffee, my hands wrapped around the mug for warmth. The words caught in my throat, the weight of them too much to bear. But I knew I couldn't keep it all inside, couldn't let it fester and grow until it consumed me completely. I had to tell him, had to let someone else in on the nightmare that my life had become. "I found out Laura was cheating on me," I said, my voice barely audible. I confronted her, and then he showed up." Eric nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. "And you lost it." I swallowed hard, the taste of bile rising in my throat. Yeah, I grabbed a bat and I hit him. I don't even know how many times. He was just there, and I couldn't stop myself. I just kept hitting him. Eric leaned forward, his expression a mix of concern and disbelief. And when you woke up this morning, he was gone? I nodded, my hands trembling as I gripped the mug tighter. Yeah, I don't know what happened to him. He could be dead, or he could be out there somewhere, planning to come after me. I don't know. Eric let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. This is bad, Mark. Really bad. If he goes to the police, you could be looking at serious jail time. And if he doesn't, then I'm living with this hanging over my head for the rest of my life, I finished for him, my voice cracking. Either way, my life is over. Eric was silent for a moment, his eyes searching my face for something, maybe a sign that I could be saved, that there was some way out of this mess. But there was nothing. I had crossed a line, one that I couldn't uncross, and now I was left to deal with the consequences. What about Laura? Eric asked quietly. What's she going to do? I shook my head, the weight of her name like a stone in my chest. I don't know. She knows what I did. She heard me on the phone with you. She might call the police, or she might just disappear. I don't even know if she still wants to be with me after all this. Eric leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. You can't stay here, Mark. It's too dangerous. If this guy comes back, or if the police start asking questions… I know, I interrupted, my voice flat. I can't stay anywhere. I don't have a home anymore. The words hung in the air, the finality of them settling over both of us. I could see the pity in Eric's eyes, the way he looked at me like I was a man already condemned. And maybe I was. Maybe there was no saving me, no way out of the mess I had made. But part of me didn't care anymore. Part of me just wanted it all to end. I think I should turn myself in, I said, the decision forming in my mind as I spoke. Maybe it's the only way to make this right. Eric's eyes widened in shock. Mark, you can't be serious. If you turn yourself in, you'll go to prison. For a long time. Maybe that's what I deserve, I replied, the words heavy with resignation. Maybe I need to pay for what I've done. Eric shook his head, his expression a mix of frustration and sadness. There has to be another way. Let me help you. We can figure this out together. But you can't just give up. I'm not giving up, I said, my voice steady. I'm facing the consequences of my actions. I did this. I deserve to pay for it. Eric looked like he wanted to argue, but he knew me too well. He knew that once I made up my mind, there was no changing it. He sighed, running a hand through his hair again. If you're sure about this, then I'll go with you. I'll stand by you, no matter what. Thanks, Eric, I said, the weight of gratitude and sorrow pressing down on me. But you don't need to get involved in this any more than you already are. This is my mess, and I need to clean it up. He didn't argue, but the look in his eyes told me that he wasn't happy about it. He stood up, grabbing his keys from the counter. If you're going to do this, then let's get it over with. I'll drive you to the police station. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest as I stood up. This was it. The end of the road. But as I followed Eric out of the apartment, a sense of calm washed over me. I had made my decision, and now there was no turning back. I was ready to face whatever was waiting for me, ready to pay for my sins. As we drove through the quiet streets, the reality of what I was about to do began to sink in. I was going to turn myself in. I was going to confess to everything. I was going to face the consequences, no matter how terrifying they might be. But as the police station came into view, a thought struck me, a thought so sudden and unexpected that it almost made me gasp out loud. What if Laura hadn't called the police? What if she hadn't told anyone? What if there was still a chance, no matter how slim, that I could get out of this? That I could fix things somehow? But I quickly squashed the thought. It didn't matter. I had already made my decision. There was no turning back now. Eric pulled up to the curb, the bright lights of the police station glaring in.